surrounded the mountains of sin. Even in the valley, shine a light in my darkness. Even in the valley, shine your light. Even in the valley, shine your light in my darkness. Even in the valley, shine your light.
Well, welcome everybody. It's great to see you. We're continuing in our series called The Journey of Joseph. If you have your Bibles, you can turn to Genesis chapter 41. Genesis chapter 41. As you're turning there, I want to give you kind of a recap of where we've been. We're looking at this guy's life, his story, his journey. It started out with him being a young man in his father's house. His name was Joseph, and he was favored. He was favored by his father, so he was despised by his brothers. His dad gives him this coat of many colors, kind of gives him favorable treatment. He begins to have dreams. He tells his brothers about his dreams. If we were to write the story right there, we would call it Joseph, keep your dreams to yourself, okay? Because he goes to his brothers and says, one day you're going to bow to me, and this is the dream I had. Well, as you can imagine, his brothers didn't like that, and so they decided they were going to kill him. They stopped just short of killing him, threw him in a pit, and saw that there was this caravan of slave traders that were on their way to Egypt, and they thought, well, we can at least make some money off of him, so they sell him into slavery. So he goes down to Egypt, and he finds himself in the house of a man named Potiphar. And as one of the slaves in Potiphar's house, he rose to the top of that kind of place, and he was able to actually lead the entire estate under Potiphar's charge. He was falsely accused, we saw that 2 weeks ago, by Potiphar's wife. She was going after him, he declined, and she falsely accused him, and he's thrown into prison. So last week, we see Joseph, he's in prison, and the cupbearer and the baker and the candlestick maker are all right there in prison with him. And the baker and the cupbearer both have these two dreams. And they tell him, they say, hey, Joseph, these are the dreams we're having. Joseph can interpret dreams. God's given him this ability. He interprets the two dreams. He looks at the cupbearer. He says, you're going to be okay. The baker, you're going to die. Both of those things end up happening. Cupbearer gets restored to his position. And Joseph says, hey, by the way, if you remember me, I gave you the good interpretation. When Pharaoh reinstalls you in your position, please remember me. I want to get out of prison. That's where we left last week. Well, 2 years later, we're here today. He has not been let out of prison. So the hope that he had that he would one day has probably faded quite a bit. And last week we looked at this kind of question of life, that why are things in life unfair? And why do we go through unfair things? And Joseph kind of showed us what that looked like. And so today, after 2 years, we're going to see how Joseph ends up as someone who has gone through this period of waiting. Now, why does this matter to you and to me? I think a few reasons, but one of the things I want to focus on today is this idea of waiting. I think a lot of us are probably in a period of waiting. Maybe you're like Joseph, where you're in a place that you can't get out of. You can't see where God is working. You know that he might be, but in the prison for 2 years, Joseph was probably asking himself, where is God working? And how is he working? This was a question that he probably asked himself again and again and again. And so you may be in a period of waiting. You're looking for answers. You're searching for a meaning, trying to figure out where is all this going to go. And it could be any type of situation. Maybe you're waiting on a medical report to come in or to change. Maybe you're seeing if your treatment's going to work. Maybe you have a child who has wandered away from the faith and you're thinking, okay, we pray for him, we pray for her. Are they ever going to come back to God? Maybe you and your spouse are so desirous to conceive a child and you want to be parents so badly, and you pray and you pray and you do all that you can and you're just waiting. When is God, or is God ever going to bless us with a child? And it doesn't really matter what happens right now if all you're in the season of waiting. Really, all you can see right there is the circumstance in front of you. You can't see all the time how God is working. We don't have a 360-degree view into the mind and will and heart of God and all that he's doing all the time in every little situation. There are things beyond our control, beyond our ability to manipulate, and Joseph was in that exact same situation. And so in this period of waiting, all of us could be left asking this question, where is God? How is God? Is God working? With that in mind, I want to walk through what happens to Joseph after this period of waiting. And what we're actually going to see is that during these 2 years where he's in prison, just hoping that maybe something might happen to get him out of prison, God was actually orchestrating events that he could have never imagined, that he could not have controlled, that actually helped tailor him for his divine purpose. And I want us to look at it through the lens of what we're going through. Because maybe I mentioned it, maybe I came nowhere near it, but here's what I do know. You know in your heart and in your life and in your mind what it is for you right now. What are you waiting on God to do? And where can you kind of not see God working, but you wish you could? Think about that as we go through this. So Genesis chapter 41, we have a lot of verses to go through, 57 verses. Never fear, I'm going to keep this to a tight 95 minutes, okay? So we'll be out of here very quickly. But no, I'm just kidding. So we're not going to read every verse. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read some of the passages, and then I'm going to summarize some of them. When I'm summarizing, I'll tell you which ones I'm summarizing so that you can kind of follow through and not get lost. So let's begin. Genesis chapter 41, verse 1. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly thin cows ate up the 7 attractive plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke, and he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears, and Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them about his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Okay, so let's go through this. So the very first thing we see is that after 2 whole years, so while all this is going on with Pharaoh, and we're going to get into his dreams, 2 whole years, Joseph is in prison, and these things are going on. He has no knowledge of them. All he knows is that he needs to remain faithful in prison. What is he doing in prison? We saw this last week. He's actually working. He's actually earned and gained favor with the guards. He's actually been elevated to this position of authority as an inmate, leading the other inmates in the prison. So while all that's kind of going on over here, we've got Pharaoh, and this situation happens to him where he has this dream. The 2 dreams are that the cows, the 7 plump cows, are eaten by the 7 ugly thin cows, and then the 7 ears of grain that are good and tasty, I guess, are eaten by the bad ears of grain. And he comes up and he says, what does all this mean? He asks the magicians. He asks the wise men of Egypt, and none of them could tell him what the dreams meant. Now, magicians didn't mean that these people were just going around doing magic tricks. These were actually scholars of the supernatural. These were people who devoted their whole lives to these kinds of phenomenon, and yet they were even saying, we don't exactly know what's going on here. And the reason why that's significant is they could have easily lied. They could have easily said, okay, Pharaoh, here's what's happening, this and that, and then that would have completely ended the chain of events that he eventually landed on Joseph's freedom. But they didn't lie. They were honest. And now Pharaoh is wondering what to do next. Genesis 41 and verse 9. Let's keep going. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted it to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Too bad for him, but I'm still here, the cupbearer says. So the cupbearer looks at Pharaoh and he goes, oh, you know what? I knew I was forgetting something. I just completely slipped my mind. There's this guy, his name's Joseph, great guy, Hebrew. He's got this ability. You should go check him out. So Pharaoh, verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. So imagine what Joseph is going through. Joseph is in a prison, probably not the best of kind of situations. He's been in and out of situations like this, but he's in prison. And all of a sudden, somebody opens the door, and they say, get your stuff, Pharaoh wants to see you. Pharaoh? Like the Pharaoh? The Pharaoh of Egypt wants to see me, Joseph? Yes, get your stuff, let's go. So he gets up and he shaves and he goes to Pharaoh, and I just can't imagine what he's going through. It's kind of like, where is this landing? And I have pretty much given up hope that this would ever happen, but for whatever reason, Pharaoh wants to see me. In verse 14, second part of verse 14. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, this is important. Joseph answered Pharaoh and said, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. I love this. Joseph showed incredible humility here. He could have said, yes, you're right. I'm very talented. I'm glad that you've heard of me. I'm glad my reputation precedes me because I'm actually incredibly gifted at interpreting dreams. Let me out of prison and I will interpret your dreams forever. No, he doesn't say that. He actually gives honor to the Lord and he says, yes, God has given me this gift, but it's God who enables me to do this. He glorified God. Verses 17 through 24, Pharaoh tells Joseph about his two dreams, about the 7 ugly cows that eat the plump cows and the 7 ears of thin grain that choke out the plump good grain. He explains this whole situation to him. He says, what does all this mean? Verses 25 through 32, Joseph tells Pharaoh, he says, look, okay, here's what your dreams mean. The first thing is the 7 years of plenty, or the 7 cows eating the other cows and the 7 grain eating the other grain actually represent 2 7-year periods. So you're going to have 2 7-year periods, 1 7-year period of abundance, of wealth, of plenty, where everyone's going to have all they need. There's going to be abundant food and abundant grain, and people are going to be so happy about that. And that 7 years is going to come to an end, and then there's going to be 7 years of famine, 7 years of want, 7 years of the lack of abundance and the lack of plenty. And those 7 years are actually going to be so bad that people are going to forget that the first 7 years ever even happened. Isn't that totally like human nature, right? It's like, doesn't matter how good those 7 years were, 1 year into the famine, it's like, hey, do you remember back when things were good? Nope. Things were never good. Things have always stunk, right? So he says, it's going to be so bad, people are going to forget that it was ever even good. And he tells them, the reason why you had 2 dreams is because God has decided, God has set this into motion. This is fixed. This cannot be changed. Now think about the boldness that Joseph had to have. Joseph is looking at Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, and he's telling him, Pharaoh, under your watch, people are going to be famished. People are going to have want, and people are going to suffer, and it's going to be under your watch in your land. That's a pretty bold statement. So Joseph was incredibly humble. He knew that all this was coming from God, and he was also, in his humility, able to be incredibly bold and confident because he knew exactly what God was leading him to say. Now, Pharaoh could have taken offense to this. Pharaoh could have said, how dare you go back to prison? How dare you come and tell me that people are going to suffer in my land? But he doesn't do that. I love what happens next. So verse 33, Joseph says, now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Okay, so Joseph was not stupid, okay? It's like, okay, Pharaoh, the next thing you need to do is you need to find a discerning and wise man, perhaps, maybe, someone who knows how to interpret dreams correctly. I don't know. I don't want to put ideas in your head, but this person may or may not be standing right here, right in front of you, okay? So he tells him that, hey, look, discerning wise man, set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years, and let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. So God has given Joseph this great wisdom and this great leadership ability. Joseph didn't say, I deserve this, give me the job. Instead, he demonstrated that he had what it took to do the job. That his experience had actually prepared him for the task. If you think about who Joseph was when his brothers first threw him into the pit, he was kind of braggy, he was kind of arrogant, he didn't have all these experiences that built this character, but now he does. And so he learned in Potiphar's house how to manage an entire estate, how to have all the moving parts and logistics work together so that Pharaoh's house could keep going, and Pharaoh trusted him with that. Then even in prison, he rose to the top in prison and managed the prison underneath the guard's authorities. And now here he is in a situation where he's looking at Pharaoh, the Pharaoh of Egypt, and he actually knows what's to be done to protect the people during the 7 years of famine. Joseph was ready. Joseph was prepared. My question for you is, what are you going through right now? You may not understand why. You may not get it. You may think, why is this so hard? What are you going through right now that you don't quite understand that could possibly be what God's allowing you to experience so that later you'll be ready to fulfill His divine purpose for your life? Joseph was ready. Joseph could not have taught him this stuff. He had to live this stuff. And he looks at Pharaoh and he says, here's what's got to happen. You got to be organized. You got to do this. You got to do that. Well, Pharaoh liked this. This proposal pleased Pharaoh. One of the things that we see often in Joseph's story is that the Lord was with him. The Lord was with him. And as the Lord was with him, people found favor upon him. And as people found favor upon him, he was able to gain more and more respect and authority. And this just kept happening. This proposal pleased Pharaoh. It didn't have to please Pharaoh. It could have offended Pharaoh. Pharaoh could have taken this personally. Pharaoh could have been threatened by Joseph, but none of those things happened. Instead, it pleased Pharaoh, verse 37, and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all of this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." So Pharaoh says, you got it. The place is yours now. Pretty amazing. Verse 41 through 45, Pharaoh sets Joseph over Egypt. He gives him fine clothes. It's interesting how it kind of came full circle. His fine clothes that he had at the beginning, the coat of many colors, was ripped off and shredded and covered in blood. And now here he is full circle. He's leading Egypt, and now he has fine clothes again. Pharaoh made others bow. He gave him a new name that literally means God spoke and he lives. He gives him a wife. We see that Joseph all along the way gives God the glory. He actually gives God the glory for his ability to interpret dreams. He talks about how God has set this into motion and this is going to happen because God wants it to happen. Joseph could have easily left that out. He could have easily left those things out, and he could have easily spoke with Pharaoh in just purely human terms, purely kind of now terms. Instead, he gives glory and honor to God at the risk of offending Pharaoh. But instead of Pharaoh being offended by that, Pharaoh is actually moved to do the same thing. So Pharaoh actually changes Joseph's name, gives him a name that literally means God has spoken and he lives. So even in a very troubling and trying circumstance, Joseph is able to influence someone with the honesty of who he is as someone who follows God. I think that's pretty amazing. Genesis 41, 46 through 50. Joseph begins his service to Pharaoh. There's 7 years of plenty. During these 7 years of plenty, Joseph is storing up food in abundance beyond measure. It says that they eventually just got to where they couldn't even count the grain that was coming in. And his wife bears him 2 sons. Genesis 41, 51 through 52. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, "God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house." The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. God has taken away the pain of the past, he says. I don't think that he literally means he just can't remember what happened at his father's house. But instead, God has made him forget what happened in the way that he no longer has to harbor the resentment. When he thinks about the pain, he no longer has to feel the pain. He looks back not with resentment, but with forgiveness and understanding of what God did and how God used those people in that circumstance for God's glory and for Joseph's good. I wonder how many of us can look back and say, this is where God was working. I wonder how many of us can look back at situations, people who have let us down, people who have abused us, people who have mistreated us, people who have taken advantage of us, and we all have things like that. I wonder how many of us look back and we harbor resentment, we harbor pain, and we harbor feelings toward them that really only impact us and burden us. Joseph was relieved of that. He was set free from that to where now when he looks back, he doesn't remember it in terms of the pain and the hate and the resentment, but rather he just says, this is what God used. This is what God used in my life to shape me and mold me into who I am. And then his next child, the name of his next child, represents the fruitfulness of God. That in the pain, God was producing something. God was shaping and molding him to be something. That in all of the vulnerability and all of the mistrust and all of the betrayal and all of the sadness that he's faced was all not in vain. But God was using it. I wonder how many of us can look back on our life, maybe even right now as you're thinking through things that you have gone through, where you can look back and say, I couldn't see it in the moment. In the moment, I was asking the question, where is God working? Where is He? What is He up to? I can't sense Him. I can't feel Him. Where is He? But now I can look back and I can say, I can see it. God used that. God made me a different person. God shaped my character. God molded me. There's things that in the moment we can't see. And Joseph is at this place where he now has these two sons. He has a wife. He has a new name. And it's just an amazing thing that's happening. Now, the 7 years of plenty come to an end. A famine was there, but there was bread in Egypt. I love this. There was a famine, but because of Joseph's leadership and God's hand on him, there was bread in Egypt. Do you understand that had this not happened, there would not have been bread in Egypt, there would not have been food, there would not have been sustenance, people would have died in droves, but because of God working through Joseph's situation, the people were fed. Pharaoh told the Egyptians to go to Joseph for bread. This is verse 57. We'll end with this. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain because the famine was severe over all the earth. So 5 minutes ago, he was in prison, and now the entire land of Egypt is instructed by Pharaoh, go to Joseph, he's the one. He's the one who can bring you food. So we're going to stop there, and we're just going to recognize for a second that this is a chapter in a mega story that God is writing in Joseph's life. And like many chapters in our lives and many situations and circumstances that we go through, this is just one of many things that God allows us to go through so that He can shape and mold our character. And we know, looking at Joseph's life, because we know the whole story, that God had bigger plans. Joseph, though, was focused and faithful in the wait. So here's my question for us this morning, and I want us to kind of think about this as we end. What do we do in the wait? What do we do when we don't know where God's going to take everything, but we're in those 2 years in prison and we're working? What do we do right there? How do we know that things are going to turn out? How do we conduct ourselves even when we don't know how things are going to turn out? I think there are two things that we can take from Joseph's experience and apply them today. The first thing is this. We're going to stay faithful even when we can't see where God is working. We're going to stay faithful. Faithful just means that we're going to remain people who trust. We're going to remain people, or become people who decide to trust, to take a step and say, I don't know where this is going to turn out, but here's what I do know. I serve a good God, and He loves me. For 2 years, Joseph waited in prison. And the hope that the cupbearer might one day, remember him, probably faded with each day that went on. But he stayed faithful. He decided to trust, even though he didn't know where things were going to go. And in the wait, he longed for something better. Our longings during the wait exist to help us long for God in a way that we would not if things were well. Part of remaining faithful is to remain in a position of, no matter where life takes me, I still long for and I still want intimacy with God. I still want to know Him. I still want to trust Him. Here's the way Paul says it in Romans 8. He says, for I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us, for the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. So he talks about suffering, but he also just talks about the fact that the entire creation, the whole world, longs and waits for the revealing of the sons of God. He goes on in verse 23, and not only the creation, but we groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. Some of you are longing for just this one statement, the redemption of your bodies. Maybe you're at a place where health problems are so pervasive and consistent. Maybe you have a chronic disease or an illness, and you're saying, one day this body will be redeemed. For in this hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes in what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. So he says, in the longing, in the wait, how do we stay faithful? We stay faithful by channeling this longing that we have for something better into hope in Jesus. That we hope not because we are hopeless, but because we are hopeful, and we know who the one that we're placing our hope in is going to come through for us in a way that we could never even ask or imagine. The second thing we see that Joseph did is we're going to trust that God's plans are better than our plans. If you remember last week, the only thing Joseph wanted was to get out of prison. That's it. He told the cupbearer, hey, look, say something nice about me. I just want to get out of prison. And probably getting out of prison and even just being a pauper would have been enough, because at least at that point he would have been a free man. But God had something in mind for Joseph that was far more than he could ever have imagined. So my question is, what are you hoping that God will do that is far beneath what he's actually able to do in your circumstances? What are you right now, when you think about if God could just do this, what are you hoping for? What is this thing that you're hoping for that is actually beneath what God's able to do? I think so often what we hope for is just to get out of prison, and God's saying, no, I actually want to prepare you for something amazing. I want to prepare you for something even better. And yet our faith and we convince ourselves with all these different ways of viewing God that no, God He doesn't have that for me. I just want out of prison. And God's saying, no, there's a greater hope. Ephesians 3:20 says that He can do far more, exceedingly abundantly more than all we can ask, think, or imagine. And Joseph experienced this, that as he stayed faithful, he understood that God's plans are better than his plans. Is this challenging time that you're going through right now preparing you for your future? That you would not have picked it. It would not have been the plan that you would have had. When you think about the way you wanted your life to go, this would not have fit into it. But is there a way for you to get to a place, for me to get to a place where we can view life through the lens of God has something good in this? And maybe it doesn't always end up like Joseph, where you're running estates, where you're leading the land of Egypt. Maybe it's just so that God can be glorified in your life and you can be more of a representation of Christ's character in that. Let me explain what I mean. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul says this. He says, for God who said, let light shine out of darkness, has shone in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. So, here's what he says. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. Okay, so this is amazing. I don't want you to miss this. First, he talks about light that's shown in our hearts, okay? So the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. So just knowing who God is a light that leads our way. And then here's what he says, jars of clay. What is a jar of clay? Well, a jar of clay is a pot. And if you think about it in your life, when you have circumstances that come that are hard, that pot gets cracked and it gets worn, right? A lot of you are cracked pots. And as we are cracked pots, and there's little holes in there, there's light in that jar of clay, which Paul says you and I are. And as that light shines through those cracks, here's what it shows. The surpassing power belongs to God. Isn't that great? So you and I in our waiting, you and I in our circumstances, don't have to be strong. The message today isn't walk out of here and be strong. The message today is walk out of here and understand that in your pain, the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ shines through when you let it. And it actually demonstrates, it shows that that power belongs to God and not to us. And in that we can rest. What Joseph did day after day was he was able to demonstrate, he was able to show, yes, there's pain, it stinks, I don't like it. But here's one thing I know, God is with me, and God is powerful. So I don't know what it is for you. I'm not sure what you're waiting on. I'm not sure what the circumstance is, but here's what I would hope we could all glean from Joseph. That we can stay faithful, we can decide to continue to trust, and at the same time, we can believe truly that God's plans are better than our plans. And all along the way, demonstrate that it's actually not us that gets us through this. It's God. It's God every time. Would you pray with me?